Okay. Does this work? Okay. Hello, good morning, everybody. So I am Stefano Caria. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the University of Oxford, and today I'm going to present joint work with Girum Abebe from the Ethiopian Development Research Institute and Esteban Ortiz Ospina, also from Oxford. And our starting premise in this work is this recent literature that makes the case that participation costs in formal labor markets in the developing world are actually quite high. And the question that we will be asking in this paper is whether these high participation costs are preventing high-quality workers from allocating their talent most productively. Okay? So you may be wondering, what are these costs? Well, actually, it takes a lot of traveling around town to find information about jobs. So people have to travel to vacancy boards, firms, and so on to collect information. They will then have to travel across town to place applications. They will then again have to travel around town to go to interviews. All of this traveling takes money, time, and effort, and all of this is costly. Now, of course, different people have a different ability to pay for these costs, and so the key question that we want to ask is, who is being screened out of the labor market, who is being excluded from participating in the labor market because of high cost? We could be in a scenario where the people who have high cost are actually low quality, in which case, yes, there is a bit of an equity issue, but on the other hand, high costs are helping firms screening low quality applicants. So in terms of efficiency, it actually works rather well. Or we could be in a scenario where the people who suffer from high cost are actually high quality, in which case not only we have an equity issue, but we also have an efficiency problem because we are losing a lot of talent. So this is the question that we want to ask in this presentation. And in a sense, we want to, there are several literatures that we are tapping from, but one key literature is this recent literature on the allocation of talent in various contexts. And this literature showed that in other contexts, in other historical periods, economies were able to generate very large gains from improving the allocation of work. So, for example, a recent paper by Shea et al. Shows that as barriers to participation in high productivity activity decreased for females and minority workers in the US was able to generate a lot of growth out of having people from these discriminated against backgrounds participate in the labor market more effectively. So is there a lot of potential that can be unleashed, that can be unlocked in African labor markets, and that is not currently being exploited because of high search cost? So that's our question. The way we're going to go about answering this question is through a combination of empirical analysis and modeling. So in particular, we're going to exploit an experiment where we study the selection of workers into a clerical job. And we are going to be able to see how the number and the quality of the people who apply for this clerical job changes as we do one or two things. First of all, as we incentivize applications, so we make it very cheap to apply for these jobs. And secondly, when we double the wage. Okay? We're going to report the reduced form results from this intervention, and this is what today's presentation is going to focus on. And after that, we are going to move on to a modeling stage, which is still work in progress. And the idea of the model is that we're going to use the reduced form results to back out some features of this joint distribution of quality and cost. And once we know what that joint distribution looks like, we can plug in those estimates in standard model, dynamic models of job search to quantify the likely misallocation of talent that can result from high search cost. Okay, so what do we find? We have three key findings. The first finding is that the application incentive is actually quite effective at increasing application rates. Okay? So when we first moved into this, lots of people were a bit skeptical. They said, oh, nobody is ever going to stake a decision so important in their life on something so small like monetary application incentive of about $4. Okay? And in fact, with a small application incentive, we are able to increase application rate by a significant 11 percentage points, or 27%, and to put that in context, that is 2/3 of the effect that you get when you double the wage. Now, it's hard to think of something more effective at increasing application rates than doubling the wage. Then you can get 2/3 of that effect just by a small monetary incentive. So it seems that the incentive at least works in terms of getting people to apply to the job. But what's even more surprising is that the quality of the applicant improves. Okay? And what do I mean by quality? We measure quality along three different dimensions: non-cognitive ability, cognitive ability and experience specific to the job. So we do not have effects on non-cognitive and experience, but we find clear effects on cognitive ability. So, and in particular, we find that not only average cognitive ability improves, but the cognitive ability improves along the distribution. So the distribution of cognitive ability that you get in the group of applicants selected through the application incentive stochastically dominates the distribution of cognitive ability that you get in the control group. So that's really our key result, and it's a result that, as you can already imagine, suggests that actually the correlation between cost and quality is positive. So we have a lot of high-quality people who are suffering from high participation costs in the labor market. And kind of substantiating the point a little more, what we find is that some of these top candidates that we're able to recruit in the application incentive treatments are coming from groups that you would expect to have high cost. So, for example, we have a higher proportion of top candidates who are women in the application incentive group, and we can do what is called the endogenous stratification exercise, so we can try to predict who is likely to have low labor market participation, and we're going to have a higher proportion of top candidates that are coming from this group with low predicted labor market participation. Okay? This is early stages of this work, and it's great that we're able to present it here so that we can get feedback. So it's a little early to talk about conclusion, but broadly speaking, the innovations here are two. First of all, there have been a number of selection experiments that people have run in recent years, and mostly people have looked at what happens when you change the wage. So there are experiments in Mexico, Uganda, and Zambia where people were changing the wage, and this is the first experiment that changes application cost. Okay, so that's the big innovation here. And in fact, we also changed the wage so we can benchmark our results to what happens when you change the wage. And secondly, although again, this is a bit more work in progress in the model, as I said, what our reduced form suggests is that actually there are a lot of high quality, high cost people in the market. And so by developing that model, we want to make a second contribution, which is to highlight a new channel through which search costs can create misallocation in the labor market. So we could talk about the labor market in Addis for a long time, but I'm just going to tell you two things about it that are relevant for this presentation. First of all, this is a market where there is wide variation in job quality, both in terms of things like do you get a permanent contract or a temporary contract, as well as in the wage. And now this is quite typical of labor markets in urban developing countries. So wage dispersion is very high. There are stark differences between formal, protected, secure jobs and jobs that are bad and unregulated, insecure. Okay, so this is a labor market where in ex ante you'd think, oh, it pays a lot to search really hard, because if you search hard enough, you're going to be able to land a job that pays well and that has security. But if you don't search enough, you can get stuck in some of these bad sectors. So the returns to search are probably very high, but at the same time, the cost of search is also very high. And in previous work, we estimated that your median job seeker spends about 16% of their weekly expenditure on items related to job search, the things that I was mentioning at the beginning, so like paying for your bus fares to travel to the center of town, printing costs, and so on and so forth. Okay? And this goes up to about a quarter of weekly expenditure for active job seekers. So returns to search are probably high, cost of search is also very high, and it's not that surprising that the result of that is that job seekers make surprisingly few applications in this labor market. Okay, so this is again from the Abebe et al., the previous study. We are tracking people over the course of 12 months, and there I'm dividing people who search below median intensity and people who search above median intensity. And what you see, that even people who are doing search activity above median search intensity, so these are people who are on average are spending about 3 months in those 12 months doing some form of search, the model behavior is to just make 1 or 2 applications to formal jobs. So let me tell you a bit more about the experiment design, and I forgot to start my timer, so you'll have to show me cards when it's 10 minutes and 5 minutes. Okay, fantastic. So in this experiment, we'll be studying recruitment of workers for a small number of... Oh, that's not a good news. We are going to study the recruitment of workers for a small number of fixed-term positions. Okay, these are going to be clerical jobs, so think data entry operators, people doing basic accountancy tasks, and these kind of jobs. So they require some skills, but they're not at the high end of the spectrum in terms of skills requirement. we will advertise these positions on the job boards and in the newspapers of the city. Okay? So this is the newspaper, this is what an ad in this newspaper looks like, and this is what our ad looks like. So people don't even know this is an experiment, this is just some job advertisement. Every time a person calls, so as you can see, people interested applicants are invited to call a set number of phone numbers. Once they call, we record some basic information about them, so we'll know some basic demographics, and we'll then randomly allocate them to one of three groups. And I'll tell you about the groups in a second. And then after we do that, we explain how they can apply for the position. So they will have to prepare a CV, a cover letter, and proof of identity, and they will have to show up at a set testing center on a given day and be prepared to take a set of tests for the whole day. So this is relatively, it's not crazily expensive, but they will have to travel to the testing center and spend the whole day there. The three groups that we allocate them to are a control group with about 1,500 callers. So these individuals are told, oh, the position pays 1,600 BER, and they are not offered any monetary reimbursement for their application costs. An application incentive group where the position still pays 1,600, but now they're offered 100 BER monetary incentive, basically reimbursement for the cost of their application costs. And finally, a high wage condition where the wage is doubled, so from 1,600 to 3,200, but applications are not incentivized. And so we're going to be able to observe the characteristics of everybody who calls. Then we're going to be able to observe the quality through test scores of everybody who applies. And then we're going to call everybody who called us, again, 30 days after the original call. And this is going to tell us give us some information about the outside options of this population, okay? Because we'll know what kind of applications to other jobs they made in the 30 days where they were choosing whether to apply to our job or not. In terms of skills, as I said, we have a set, we draw heavily from the literature in organizational economics, and we'll have a detailed, very detailed picture of their cognitive skills, so we'll use the best tests out there, Raven and Stroop. Non-cognitive skill, we have Big Five, GRIT, all the standard things. And we have also a very detailed picture of their experience, so we use some of the trade literature that divides things of jobs in terms of the tasks that you do on the job. And we have a detailed, fine-grained picture of the experience in each type of task, so manual task, routine tasks, problem-solving tasks of each of these job seekers. And we can construct an index of experience that is relevant for the job. The experiment works well, so we have a good balance. This is a balanced test. As you can see, this is an F test, testing the null that the groups are balanced. You can never reject. We have a small, admittedly a small set of covariates. These are the things that we can ask in a short phone call when the people first call us, but all of these are balanced, okay? And the other thing that I should say is that we have a large sample of callers, so this is 4,700 callers. We do this over the course of about 4 months, so we advertise the position, that then stop advertising it, then advertise it again, and so we can collect a large number of calls through this system, and this gives us a lot of variation in terms of the demographics. So we have people from different backgrounds, as well as where the participants, the callers, live in the city. Okay, so this is relatively representative. I mean, of course, it's selected, but we have a lot of variation in terms of many of the demographics. So what do we find? We follow a pre-analysis plan that is registered there, and we're going to first look at application rates. So we're going to regress a simple dummy for whether people apply for the job or not, on dummies for whether they were offered the incentive or they were offered the high wage. Okay? And these are the results. So as I was saying, we have an about 11 percentage points increase in application rate, highly significant, which corresponds to about a 27% increase over a mean application rate in the control group of 41%. And this is about 2/3 of the effect that you get when you double the wage, which is an 18 percentage points increase. Okay, so large effects and significant effects on applications. What about quality? So this is an index of cognitive ability that combines Raven and Stroop, and I'm going to show you results for quantitative regression at 5 points of the distribution that we committed to look at in the pre-analysis plan. 90th percentile, 75th percentile, the median, 25th and 10th. So here you get a good picture of how quality is changing across the distribution. And what you see is that actually we have positive coefficients throughout, many of which, especially at the top, are statistically significant. So this means we're having more quality at the top of the distribution, but really across the distribution as well. Now, this is an index that combines Stroop and Raven, so it's hard to interpret what exactly means in terms of magnitude. To give you a sense of the magnitude, the average test score on the Raven test increases by about 1 correctly answered question. The Dalbo et al. Paper in Mexico, which is a key paper that also finds results in terms of improved cognitive ability, finds an effect that is half of that, half an extra correctly answered question in the Raven test. So these results are rather large compared to comparable studies in this literature. Now, we chose these particular percentiles. We could have chosen other ones because the striking thing is that actually cognitive ability improves uniformly across the distribution. So it's basically, this is a CDF of cognitive ability, and you can see that there is this nice relationship of stochastic dominance across the distribution. So you can pick any percentile, any point of cognitive ability, and there will be more people that satisfy that, the condition of having that cognitive ability or more in our incentive group. And these are the CDFs for non-cognitive skills, so Big Five in grit and experience, but I can do it also in a more disaggregated way, and anyway, so there we find very little. So then the two groups are very comparable in terms of experience and non-cognitive skills. So the last thing that I want to say is about who are these top applicants. And let me define for simplicity a top applicant, somebody who scores more than 90, whose score is higher than the 90th percentile of the distribution in the control group. So we have 60 people who are top applicant according to that definition in the control group, 80% of whom are women. Now that doubles in both treatment groups. We have about 120 top applicants. But the striking fact is that people, women applicants, not only you have more, you would mechanically have more, but you have proportionally more women. Okay? And this holds if we look at this predicted search effort score, which you can do following this endogenous stratification technique. So when you try to predict who is likely to have low search effort and who isn't, we find not only an increase of top applicants who have low predicted search effort, but an increase in a proportion of these top applicants. So almost 40% of the top applicants now in the incentive group are predicted to have low search effort. So this is consistent with our story. Finally, I'm probably running out of time, we are worried about alternative things that could have happened. So did the treatment change belief about your own ability, or did treatment, so that's point 2, or did treatments change belief about the position, so you thought it was a different position, or did treatments change test effort? And we can rule out that either of these channels is driving the effect of the application incentive. So this is a quite robust effect. So just to conclude, the next step is taking these reduced form results that are quite surprising, suggest this positive correlation between cost and ability that many of us would not have expected. We probably thought that it was more natural to think that high-cost people are low quality. In fact, it's the other way around. We want to take this to a model to structurally estimate exactly what this correlation looks like, and then plug it in a dynamic model of job search and quantify misallocation. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stefano. I thought that was a very interesting paper. Yeah, I think the research question is interesting. I think the results are important. You have a nice large sample. The experimental design is nice and clean. And obviously, as you said, the main result is that increasing wages or incentivizing applications doesn't just increase the number of applications, which would have been an interesting result on its own, but it increases the quality of applications, which seems like a surprising result to me, but I mean, very important certainly. And then perhaps even more importantly than the increase in the kind of average quality of the applications is that this increase in quality is particularly large at the top of the ability, as you emphasize, and that means it's likely to impact the quality of hires, which makes this of obvious relevance. So the sense that I get is that you're still working on this paper, so I'm not going to discuss things that I think you're about to address anyway. So let me focus on a couple of issues around the interpretation of the results that may or may not be useful. So the first question that struck me is that, as far as I can understand, applying for this job means coming on one of the testing days and sitting what seems like quite an exhaustive battery of psychological and ability tests, which I guess isn't the standard way of applying for a job, right? I think it would have been interesting to see more about how long that took, and just to discuss whether that in itself would have been a disincentive to attend. I get the sense from some of the sample sizes that some individuals didn't finish all of the non-cognitive tests, and sort of just discussing whether that was seen to be kind of an arduous or a tedious thing would be interesting, because I guess the concern is that there's an heterogeneity in the willingness to sit these tests, which has been confounded with heterogeneity in more general application costs to jobs where the application process is just submitting a resume, right? And just thinking through whether that casts any doubt over the generalizability of the study's results. The second thing that was very interesting and also a little bit surprising was the large negative effect of the high wage treatment on employment. So I don't think you discussed it here. But I wondered whether it's possible that incentivizing people to apply for a job by increasing the wage, whether that could have a negative impact on the people who don't get the job by increasing the reference wage and the reservation wage, and then leading them to turn down wages. I don't know whether that's worth exploring. But the other thing that I think you could expand a little bit on in the paper is just the timing of at which point individuals were informed whether or not they received the job. So by the time the second telephone call occurs 30 days after the initial call, were they already told that they didn't get the job? I guess if they weren't, then maybe it's not surprising that, particularly for the high wage, that people are less likely to be employed. They may be waiting to hear about this kind of lucrative job. If they have heard, then well, it'd be interesting to know. Maybe that affects the beliefs. Maybe that disappointment affects the beliefs about some of these non-wage attributes of the job. Then the paper also investigates whether incentives work by attracting individuals with a higher opportunity cost of time, and you test for that by comparing the probability that someone is in wage employment. But I guess there are other dimensions of high opportunity cost, right? Like household obligations or the existence of attractive wage opportunities. And I was wondering whether you have the data to explore some of those things, because that I guess that would be quite interesting. My sense is you only discussed the share of women in the top ability score distribution, but it seems to me like more women applied if they're incentivized, which would be consistent. It seems like kind of high opportunity cost individuals being incentivized to apply for this job. Okay, and being mindful of time, let me stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just say super quickly, just a couple of things. Thanks, these are super helpful comments. So the test takes from about 9:30 a.m. to about 2 p.m. Okay. So it's a substantial amount of time. It's not crazy compared to what they would have done otherwise. So lots of firms in Ethiopia use standardized tests, so they would call them either for interviews or for tests. It's probably a bit longer, but it's not an inordinate amount of time. And also the fact that 41% of people applying the control group shows that at least willingness to bear the time cost is fairly... the other results there are two results that you were mentioning that are in the paper but not in the slides. One is that we're still trying to understand is that when you offer people the high wage, what we observe is that these people are less likely to get a job elsewhere in the economy. Okay? And we find some decrease, but insignificant in terms of search effort, but then a significant decrease in terms of the interviews that they get, the offers that they get, and the jobs that they get. Okay? And so in a sense that is consistent with our story that if there are a very high search costs and you have to optimize, getting the high wage offer makes you crowd out search effort from other activities into our job, and that decreases your outcomes in elsewhere in the labor market. Now, it's also true that when we offer the high wage treatment, people's expectation about what they're going to get in the labor market changes. It doesn't for the incentive, so it doesn't change the interpretation of the incentive treatment, it changes for the high wage, so they think of themselves as a little better, I guess. And so we're now exploring some mediation analysis to try to disentangle to what extent the changes in belief versus the changes in cost is driving the effect on, so it's tentative. But what I know that there is no change in belief to change the interpretation of the application incentive. And I think I'll leave this at that, and I'll open up for questions. Thank you.
So we don't have enough time, but we can take
There's a
And
question
two
up there.
or three questions.
Thank you. I have one question about the design, or maybe more kind of an informed guess on your side. You varied the wage that you advertised, but you only told them the wage after they applied, right? Not in the job advert. I was wondering, like, if you have any idea or sense of what the implications would be if you already post the wage on the job advert themselves, and like how this selection margin might also like affect candidate selection.
Are there more questions? Or,
Allocation?
Yeah, let's take a round and I'll, thanks.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to ask, you didn't speak anything about the cost of the two programs, so they have similar effects, but which one ended up being more costly?
Okay, let me take these two for now, and then if there are more. So it is standard for the jobs ads. So, for example, the one that I showed, not to reveal the wage in advance. So, in a sense, one thing that we were very concerned about was to make this as much a natural field experiment as possible, so people do not know they're part of an experiment. They only find out in the last phone call. In fact, they find out at the end of the testing session, where we start asking them a few questions that are not your standard interview questions, but up to all these cognitive skills course, up to that point in the experiment, people just think they're applying for a job and there are no researchers involved. They're actually applying for a job and there are jobs there, just they have no information that this is part of an experiment. So we wanted to replicate what happens in the labor market. Now, in a sense, I wouldn't expect it to have, of course, if we would have advertised the wage in advance, it would have created an initial selection margin. It would have probably gone in the same direction, I think. So we would have got more calls and then calls from probably better people, I imagine. But yeah. So cost, it all depends on how many people you decide to interview and how many people you like to hire. And we don't have, in a sense, we're not there yet because we just changed the wage once and the incentive once, so it's not clear what the optimal size of the incentive and the wage is. In these cases, the application incentive is more costly because we wanted to collect as much data as possible. For reasonable figures, they could have the same cost, or even the application incentive could dominate. Consider that here this is only a 3 months position, so doubling the wage doesn't cost you that much because it's only 3 months. But of course, you have to double the wage forever. Then the application incentive becomes much more appealing. Yeah.
As a last question, maybe. Yeah, there is one there.
One more question there.
Thank you. It's a great paper. If anything, I'm kind of amazed. I mean, these results are brilliant. It's like, it's really, really relatively small intervention leads to huge outcomes. So I guess my question is, if these firms are getting higher quality applicants, are they not doing this already, or why aren't they doing this already?
So we have a lab experiment with firms to elicit their beliefs about what the results of this intervention would be. We're still analyzing, so this is preliminary. To some extent, the firms are very good actually at guessing the impact in terms of application rates. So in fact, their average guess is exactly the right number. So there is this wisdom of crowd effect in terms of getting the application rate size right. They have more biased beliefs when it comes to the improvement in quality. And the other thing is they have very uncertain beliefs. So not only firms have the wrong belief, but also they feel very uncertain about what the effect of something like that would be, which of course prevents experimentation. In general equilibrium, if all firms started doing this, of course things would be very different. So, but why the marginal firm is not trying to do this, and then that's probably because of this experimentation cost and wrong beliefs.
I think pass the next presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rulof Berger. I'm presenting joint work with Martin Abel and Patrizio Pereno. it's on the value of reference letters, and I'm going to be showing you some experimental evidence from South Africa. Before I do, let me just acknowledge the importance of our funders, PSPPD and the World Bank Gender Innovation Lab, and our collaborators, JPL Africa, who is responsible for the field work, and the Department of Labour in South Africa, whose career counsellors implemented the intervention in their labour centres. So the motivation for the study is that South Africa suffers from very high unemployment in general, and particularly for young South Africans. So this study focuses on the issue of information asymmetries, which possibly makes it difficult for firms to accurately screen applicants, and this may be a particularly large problem for small South African firms. So it's often speculated in the South African labour market literature that there's this large group of young job seekers with less than a university qualification who find it difficult to credibly screen or to credibly signal to firms whether they're high or low ability, and that firms in response have turned towards social networks to fill these vacancies. So why is this a problem? Well, first of all, it places high ability applicants with weak labour market attachment at a disadvantage. But secondly, there's a gender angle that is problematic. Firstly, we know female job seekers are in South Africa particularly reliant on social networks when they look for work, but that these networks aren't as useful or as valuable for them as they are for their male counterparts. And secondly, it's possible that, particularly I guess in male-dominated firms, that when firms receive information about women, that they underestimate the skills, or they interpret the information with more uncertainty than they do for male applicants. And in both of these cases, we think addressing some of these information asymmetries would not just help firms to choose applicants that are better suited for the vacancies, but it may empower females to perform better in their ability of finding jobs and finding the right jobs. Okay, so we look at reference letters, and we do so partly based on the fact that we observe only 2% of individuals in our control group using reference letters as part of their application. So we've excluded the highly skilled in South Africa. But in the labour market that we study, it's very rare for people to use reference letters clearly. And when we look at the reference letters that are used, generally they're highly generic with no information about skills or even the references contact information. And except for the fact that usually there isn't a reference letter, quite often applications don't list any contactable references. And when there are contactable references, often it will be a family member or a friend. Now, not surprisingly, when we spoke to firms as part of the study, they expressed a strong desire for more information on cognitive and non-cognitive skills from reliable sources, preferably from previous employers. So based on this feedback, we designed a reference letter template that previous employers could easily complete, and it looks like this. So this is the completed version of the template that we gave to young job seekers and that they could take to a previous employer and ask them to complete. The previous employer would then fill in some information about themselves, some contact information, where they work, what position they're in, how they know the previous employee, and then they can rank the employee in terms of non-cognitive and cognitive skills. Non-cognitive skills include team ability, interpersonal skills, work ethic, reliability, and agreeability, and skills, or cognitive skills include numeracy, literacy, computer literacy, learning ability, and then they could add a couple of other skills that may be relevant to the occupation. And the reference could then rate the individual as very good, good, average, below average, or cannot rate, and there's a space to write additional comments if they're so inclined. So our belief is that this is probably an easier way for the employer to complete the reference letter. They don't have to go to their computer and sit down, maybe get the last reference letter that they wrote and just change the name and print this out and give it to an applicant. And the fact that the job seeker knows that it's lower effort for the person that they're asking to be a reference may sort of make them more inclined to seek these reference letters. In the paper we have a theoretical model. I don't want to go into this because of time constraints, but let me just briefly kind of outline how we think this may work. We assume that individuals are heterogeneous in their ability, and firms can't observe ability, but individuals are endowed with an application signal, which is a noisy signal of their ability. And when they apply, they essentially reveal their application signal to a potential employer. And then some individuals are also endowed with a reference letter signal, which is a different noisy signal of ability. job applicants can decide whether they want to reveal the reference letter signal, and then based on whether they do and what the reference letter signal is and what the application signal is, the firm then forms a belief about the applicant's ability, and they have to make a decision whether to hire this individual or not. So the model makes a couple of predictions that we can compare to the results from our study. The first two are that the only way in which the reference letter would work is if the letters are informative about the applicant's ability, and also if it contains information that's not already contained in the applicant's resume. If these two conditions are met, then the model makes a couple of predictions. Firstly, not including a reference should result in downward adjustment in expected ability. Secondly, firms will be more likely to hire candidates with stronger letters. Thirdly, the use of such letters should result in a closer mapping from ability to job offers. The fourth prediction is that less credible references should be less effective. The fifth prediction, which is particularly relevant for the gender dimension, is that if employers are more uncertain about the skills of specific job seekers, then the content of the reference letter should matter more. And then we have a couple of general equilibrium predictions, which I'm not going to go into because we can't explicitly test them. The study sample consists of participants from the ESA database. They're registered job seekers from 4 participating labour centres in Gauteng and Limpopo. We restrict the sample to those with work experience between the ages of 18 and 34. With less than university education, we also restrict the sample to Black Africans. We stratify by gender, so there's gender balance. On average, the participants are about 27 years old, and 2/3 have completed secondary education. The causal mechanism that we think about has a couple of different links. So firstly, job seekers must obtain letters. If they obtain the letters, then they must include it correctly in the application, and then the employer must believe that this reference letter contains information. They must update their belief. So we designed a bunch of different experiments to test the different links in this causal chain. Specifically, there are 3 experiments. The first one looks at the employer's response to reference letters. In this experiment, we encourage slightly more than 400 participants to return completed reference letters to us. They write numeracy and literacy tests, and then we submit more than 2,000 applications on behalf of the 102 job seekers who return the letter in a within-subject randomization of whether reference letters are attached. So let me just show you the experimental design. We choose 6 similar vacancies and 4 participants that are similar and have the required experience for the vacancy. And then for the first 4 vacancies, well, for all 6 vacancies, we apply on behalf of all the participants, but we randomly decide whether we will include a reference letter along with the regular application that these individuals submit. And in the 5th vacancy, we don't include any references. In the 6th vacancy, we include 3 reference letters, and that allows us to easily test how well people do with the reference letter compared to how they do without the reference letter. And it also allows us to get some measure of whether there's a displacement effect and a novelty effect, whether the novelty wears off if there are several reference letters. The second experiment takes us out of the application process. So we have 1,300 job seekers that we randomly assign to a control or treatment day. The treatment R then receives individual sessions with career counsellors that talk about the importance of the reference letters, and then they're given serial copies of the template. And then we call them back 5 weeks and 3 months later, and we ask them about job search, about interviews, and about employment. And then finally, we have a barriers to obtaining letters experiment in which we take 500 job seekers who were previously encouraged to obtain a letter, and we randomly assign them to groups, and we see whether there's any effect to providing individuals with information about how important these reference letters are based on our study results, giving them money or giving them both information and money. Okay, so the first question is, do reference letters have value? And looking at the results from our first study where we apply on behalf of these individuals, what we find is that the reference letter in this within subject randomization where we include individual fixed effects, we find that including the reference letter significantly and substantially increases the probability that someone will receive a callback. We have 2 measures here, a broad and a narrow definition. This one is if the firm came back. The narrow definition is if the firm came back and said, we want an interview. The broad definition is if they express some interest, maybe they ask for additional information. At that point, we didn't want to kind of reply on behalf of the applicant, so we just gave it over to the applicant. But in both of these cases, we find that the probability of receiving a callback is increased by about 60%, and the effect seems to be substantially, but not in this case significantly higher for females than it is for males. We find no evidence of a displacement effect or a novelty effect. although the former is somewhat imprecisely estimated. Next, we run the same regression, but we include the aptitude of individuals. So this is how well they did in the numeracy and the literacy test that we had them write, information that's not available to the employer when they make a decision. And we see that aptitude has no impact for individuals who were not included in the reference letter group, individuals when the reference letter is not attached, but when the reference letter is attached, people with higher aptitudes are much more likely to receive a callback. So it seems like there's information in the reference letter that allows firms to better identify high ability candidates. There's no gender effect in this regression. Gender doesn't seem to matter in producing a closer mapping from ability to callbacks. This next table is from the second experiment, where we take ourselves out of the equation, we give individuals the templates, and then we call them back 3 months later and we ask them how they're doing. In the pooled regression, we don't find any significant results, but when we split the sample by females and males, we find a substantial employment effect for females. Both in terms of the number of interviews they got and the probability of escaping unemployment. In fact, the employment effect for females is to increase the probability of finding work by 6 percentage points for the ITT, by 12 percentage points for the late, compared to a 12% control mean. So these are large employment effects, and we think they're indicative of the fact that these reference letters could have a real employment effect. Okay, so we think there's some evidence from two different experiments that these reference letters add value. The next question is, how do firms use the reference letters? So we return now to the first experiment where we applied on behalf of these applicants, and we include in the regression, in this first regression, we regress how the reference rated these individuals in numeracy and literacy, and how these individuals, we regress that on how these individuals performed in the numeracy and literacy test that we had them write. And we find that these two things are highly correlated when we don't include any controls, but even if we control other things that would be information that would be available to in the application, like years of education and how well they performed in school, there's still a positive correlation. And we think that means that there's some information in these reference letters that at least partly truthfully completed. It provides information to the firms, and information that's not easily accessible from the information that's already in the application. The next thing we do is we include the reference rating, so the content of the reference letter, in this callback regression. And if we just include it on its own linearly, then there doesn't seem to be any effect. It doesn't seem like the content of the reference letter matter, but that changes when we do one or two things. If we allow for differences between men and women, we see that the reference letter seems to have a much stronger effect for females, and this effect is now significant, and no effect for males. And then secondly, if we include a dummy for all positive, then we see the following result. We see in general better references are more valuable, until you get to the point where the reference just wrote down very good, very good, very good, very good with no variation. That seems to be penalized as being an implausibly positive reference letter. So apart from that, better reference letters are more valuable. And then the last question, obviously, that is important is, if these reference letters are so valuable, then why aren't they used more frequently? We asked individuals why they didn't get them, and usually the answer is because they didn't ask for them. So we did this third experiment that I discussed, and what we find is that providing individuals with money to get the reference letters back didn't really do anything. If we provide them with information that these reference letters are very valuable, then that significantly increases the probability that they'll get the reference letter and return it to us, which we think means that the use of reference letters is constrained by this erroneous belief that they're not very valuable. And then the very last thing that we did, partly to try to understand why individuals aren't learning that these reference letters are useful, but partly also to understand the gendered effect of giving individuals reference letters on their employment, is we informed participants about a vacancy, and we asked them to apply to us. We didn't inform them sort of as us, so we were sort of invisible in this process, but that allowed us to see what individuals included when they applied for these vacancies. And what we find is that being included in the reference letter group or gender didn't have an impact on whether you applied for the job. But it did have an impact on whether you included a reference letter. Obviously, being in the reference letter group increased the probability of including a reference letter, but that effect was completely driven by females. Males, for whatever reason, if they were in the reference letter group, they didn't seem to use it in their applications, and females did, and we think that that explains, that low usage explains maybe why individuals aren't learning about how useful these things are, and it also explains why the reference letters seem to be more useful for males than females. Right, so let me stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rulof. Great paper, great presentation. It's very polished, so I have a few comments. So I have a couple of general comments, a couple of specific comments on the analysis. In terms of general comments, let me just give a couple of thoughts that I had when I started thinking, oh, is reference letter a good policy that we can use in labor markets as an active labor market policy? And I started thinking, what could be the problems, of course? I mean, we've seen the benefit, but what could be the problems? Well, one thing that we know from the literature is that employers tend to be very prejudiced against certain groups. It doesn't seem to be the case in your context. So, for example, ratings of women and male workers are very similar. I think for an outcome or two are even better for females, so it suggests that at least they're not heavily discriminating against women. But in many other cases, we know that they are. So, for example, there is a work by Amanda Pallet in France. With Paolo Falco, we run lab experiments in Ghana between employer and employees. And employers think that women employees are less trustworthy than male employees, and it's the other way around. So one potential problem that I can see with this policy is the fact that it may compound the importance of these biases in the market. A second issue to think about is suppose that we move to an equilibrium where, at least for some groups of job seekers, reference letters are widely used. Well, that would give a lot of power to employers. Now, everything that we see here is conditional on you having worked under the employer in the no-reference letter equilibrium, and then we introduce reference letters, because the people have to go back, contact their previous employers, and see, can you please rate my performance? Once this was known ex ante, this would change both the incentives of the worker and the employer in the workplace. And one thing that I would be worried about a little bit is giving excessive power to employers. These are probably relatively vulnerable, young, unemployed people in a labor market with a lot of unemployment and long spells in unemployment if you end up losing your job. So one potential thing that I would worry about is giving undue power to employers. Now, as you can see from this comment 1 and 2, I've been thinking about this paper mostly as an active labor market policy paper. But I think this is a decision really you need to make, and that's possibly my one broad comment in terms of framing the paper. Is this an asymmetric information paper? So is there a real contribution here that we are learning how bad these asymmetric information problems are in this labor market, or is this more of a policy paper where you're really proposing this as an intervention? So I think both would be great papers, but perhaps in the introduction it would be good to pick one fight as opposed to two. And similarly, which then takes me to the model, which is what we were chatting about in a couple of days back, which I think adds a lot of value, especially if it's an asymmetric information paper, not as much if it's a policy paper. Because if it's a policy paper, most likely it's going to be something targeted to specific groups. And there, the key thing that I would worry about is that in your model, I mean, you didn't present it, but basically all these results hinge on the assumption that employers hire any worker for whom the expected ability is above a certain threshold. And of course, that means that once you improve signals, then they make no mistakes. They hire everybody who's really above that threshold. Of course, in a different model where employers have a fixed number of jobs and they were just deciding how to allocate these jobs, there would be no employment effect from moving from possibly some, but yes. So I would want to see that assumption relax if that's going to be a substantive part of the model. Finally, let me leave time for other people to comment, but I'll just have a couple of things on the analysis. You think a lot of worker quality in terms of general skills, it seems to me, because you have a literacy test and numeracy test. But I would have thought that what reference letters are great at is revealing job-specific skills. So here are things that will be difficult to put on a CV or like on some standardized test, but the employer sees this person doing exactly this kind of task and knows what their strengths and weaknesses are at that task. So I was wondering whether you could do a little bit more analysis, especially in your audit study, looking at what happens when people are sending reference letters obtained from an employer in that particular sector. Is there an advantage? We should suggest that a lot of the extra information coming from this letter is something specific to jobs and not just general. It's great that you run 3 experiments in one paper. One challenge perhaps in the paper is that it's using, it's not experiment 1, experiment 2, experiment 3, but it's keep going back and forth, which makes a lot of sense, but it would be nice to have a little bit more of a sense of how some of these things generalize. So in particular, employment effects. They're mostly coming from experiment 2. Are there employment effects in experiment 1 and 3, and so on? Yes, so that would be nice. And finally, I have a boring comment, which is you use area fixed effects across, and you say, and so I was a bit wondering about the decision. If it's balanced by area, then I would think that the main worry would be perhaps they're competing for jobs in the same locality. So my shock is inversely related to your shock. And if that's the problem you have in mind, clustering by area, not putting fixed effect, would be a better way of dealing with that problem. But maybe you're dealing with a different problem that I hadn't thought of, but I had to put in at least one boring comment, sorry. All right, so thank you.
Yeah, actually, let me sit down. Thanks, Stefano. I think that's very useful. So a couple of the general comments I completely agree with. I think we'll have to go think about the best way to deal with them and what they imply for kind of rolling this out as a policy. So your point about so I guess the point about endogenizing the employment threshold, I think that's a very good point. Yeah, if we want to expand that, because I think you're right. I do think the model, even if we do that, I think there would be employment effects because of the improved matching if you set up the production function the right way. But you're right, that is an assumption, and maybe we should reconsider whether we allow that to be exogenous. Your point about the job-specific information, I completely agree. We have, especially in the audit experiment, there's a lot of information that we're not using at the moment. We don't distinguish between hard and soft skills in our reference letter rating. We don't distinguish between whether it was a male or a female that wrote the reference letter. These are all things that we're kind of thinking about, but that for this paper and some of these regressions we've estimated, but as you point out, there seems to be kind of a lot going on in the paper, so for that reason we try to trim that down. But I think that's an excellent point, and yeah, that we'll definitely look into that. Yeah, I think those are the two things. Thanks a lot.
We have time for some questions, maybe. There is one there.
Thank you very much. I was wondering a bit in the spirit of the comment made by Stefano. So is it possible that once I receive my reference letter, I learn about my own skills? Actually, I discover about my own skills. So it could affect maybe my job search strategy. It could affect my reservation wage. And I think it's a bit in the spirit of the experiment that Bassi did in Uganda. I don't know if you've read this paper. So once they inform the job candidates about actually their cognitive scores, they see that they tend to reject more often job offers because they update their belief about their skills and their reservation wage. So maybe, because it went very fast, maybe one of the design can rule this out, but yeah. Just an idea, if you could take that into account.
Questions? You can answer. Okay, go on.
So can I ask how you are going to translate this into policy? Because obviously there's a general equilibrium effect. So if all you're doing is changing the applicants, then what that applicant is doing is displacing another. So unless you've got a mechanism in your mind by which this is going to lower the cost of labour to the firm, you're not actually going to increase employment.
allocations. Okay, so you can answer.
Okay, so regarding the effect of the reference letter on one's own skill and the reservation wage, we did actually we played around with that a little bit in what we're thinking of sort of doing for a different study. There seems to be some gender effects to how people respond to some of this information that they get from the numeracy and literacy tests. But I guess what we find most interesting is that giving individuals the reference letter. So we can't find any significant effects on job search strategy for males or females, although there does seem to be an imprecisely estimated increase in the number of applications for females. There does seem to be something going on in the number of interviews they get and the probability of finding work. So I guess what we think is the reduced form effect, however it works, it seems to be working out well for females. It seems to be helping them. And we're probably not powered to kind of disentangle exactly the causal channel through which it works when we just give them the template. But I mean that may well be a part of it. Yeah. So I think that's useful, and we could probably sort of look into that a little bit more. Francis, about how to translate this into policy. So it is. As you know, it's difficult to say anything about the general equilibrium effects for this. I showed you we have in a part of our experimental design we try to estimate displacement effects. We find no evidence of them, but I can't. Our experimental design isn't such that we'd be powered to find evidence of any conceivable type of displacement effect. That certainly is true. I think that point is well taken. But I think what is very interesting for us is that when we apply on behalf of candidates, it is the more able candidates who are the ones who are getting the callbacks. And if we look at individuals who get a callback, after we included the reference letter, they are individuals who are more able in terms of how they performed in our maths and our literacy tests than the individuals who get a callback without the reference letter. So we think there is evidence that these reference letters are helping firms identify individuals that are better suited for the kind of jobs that for the kind of vacancies that they want to fill. Presumably, maths and literacy isn't the things that these reference letters are most useful for. We think the results would be even stronger when you care about the non-cognitive skills, but that's difficult to verify. And certainly that's very consistent with the story that we were told by the employers when we discussed this with them. So I think based on that, maybe not 100% convincing evidence, but I think evidence that's certainly suggestive that this isn't just having some individuals leapfrog over others and everything stays constant. I do think it adds value to firms, and that it's quite possible that could have a general equilibrium, that could increase aggregate employment rather than just helping women and individuals with a weak labour market attachment improve their probabilities of also getting work. I mean, I think both of those things are desirable, but we believe that the results are certainly consistent with there being an aggregate employment effect as well.
Okay, I think we can go to the next presentation. Thank you. Thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrew Carr from Data First at the University of Cape Town, and I'm going to be talking about worker flows, job flows and churning in South Africa, using some admin data from the South African Revenue Service. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge funding from UNU WIDA and also the National Treasury and South African Revenue Service who made this data available to a number of people under this UNU WIDA project, and hopefully to a slightly broader group of researchers in the future. So I think it's no surprise, since you're in a labour session, labour markets are characterised by extremely high job and worker flows. I'm being told not to move around too much, so I'm going to have to follow those instructions. Ideally, we'd like admin data. So initially, to measure these flows, initially there was a lot of work done in the US on panel data of individuals or households, and the more recent work mostly started off by Burgess et al. In 2000, About et al. In 1999, looking at admin data matched firm and worker data to be able to measure these types of flows. So I'm going to be using SARS data. It's anonymized, and it's basically the entire set of individual tax returns, which contain individual identifiers and firm identifiers. So we can basically measure who's moving between employers and how often that happens. So low levels of churning can be indicative of a rigid labor market. And so that's something, clearly South Africa, as Rulof was mentioning in the presentation before, we have a high unemployment rate, and one of the obvious causes of that is potentially a rigid labor market in which firms may not be able to adjust their employment levels to their desired amounts as easily as they might in some other countries. So we want to investigate that. But on the other side, there's a paper by Banerjee et al. On individual panel data in South Africa, and their comment was, we are struck by just how much churning there appears to be in the labor market. What they mean by churning is quite different to what I mean here, but basically they're looking at movement between the formal sector, the informal sector, not economically active, and unemployment. And to preview the main results, fairly large worker and job flows are found in the SARS data, and there are a few results that indicate, as well as these relatively high job and worker flows, there's some other results that suggest less rigidity that might have previously been thought. So what do I mean by job flows? A firm between now and the previous years increased employment by 10. So let's say it starts off with 10 employees, it increases the number of employees to 20, so that's an increase of 10, and that's a job flow. But it may have got there in multiple different ways. It could have hired 15 and got rid of 5. It could have just hired 10 and got rid of none. And so that's the worker flow, the measure of hires plus separations in any particular period. And then what I mean by churning is that difference between a worker flow measure and the job flow measure. And in the sort of Mortensen, Pissarides labor market models, churning doesn't exist. So there's no churning. So what's interesting about the Burgess work and what I'm trying to replicate in this paper is that actually churning is a very substantial part of labor market flows. Firms don't just increase from 10 to 20 by hiring 10 and getting rid of 0. That there's a lot more worker flow going on in any particular firm, or in firms in general, than just the numbers that you might think looking at the increases in employment. And following Davis et al., we're going to be using average employment at T and T-1 when we look at the flow rates. And we're using something called the reallocation method, and what that is just looking at your employer's ID now and your employer's ID 1 year later. Rather than, so what that misses, the reallocation method misses short-term spells. So between now and next year, you might have a job and then leave a job and arrive at another one. And so we're missing those kind of flows if we're just looking at which employer are you now and which employer are you at next year. So this is admin data. We're using this subsequent to my research. There's been a bit more data being released, but I'm using 4 years of data from 2011 to 2014. Every individual is issued an IRP5 tax certificate if they work in a PAYE tax-registered firm, except if they earn less than 2,000 Rand per year. So basically everyone is supposed to be issued a tax certificate if they work in a PAYE registered firm. And if I compare this, the employment in the IRP5 data to employment measured in the household surveys, it's about 70% of total employment. And that's a very similar number to what gets reported from the household surveys. They don't ask them, do you get issued a tax certificate, but are you in a formal job? And about 70% of people say yes, they are in a formal job. So obviously those are not quite the same thing, but I'm basically saying it's a reasonable, the tax data seems to be a reasonable total amount of employment relative to the household surveys and what people say in those surveys. So what do we have? We've got information on period of employment during a particular tax year. I'll talk a bit more about that. We've got earnings, and we've got a firm and a worker identifier. So we don't have identifiers for those without a South African ID number, and so we have to drop about 350,000 individuals in each year out of about approximately 9 million. And then there was some disaster. Somebody described it as, I better not say that since I'm live on TV. And there was a bit of a disaster, and at some point retirement and labor income were not separated in the data. So what you have potentially is a whole lot of people whose income is coming from a pension fund rather than employment. And so I made quite a big effort to cut out. You can see I've found 1.1 million observations that come from 23 firms, and these are very likely, in a bunch of work that I've done, to be actually retirement funds paying out people who are retired. So I've cut those out, but it does mean that there are, in those years, there's 500,000 people who shouldn't be there who really are retired. Firm births and deaths are not recorded, and so I'm assuming that a birth is an appearance of a firm in the data for the first time, and a death is a disappearance. And there is a bunch of research. I think there's a paper on the German administrative data showing that this can actually make a substantial impact. And what I'm basically say as well, if we don't use these death rates, but we use death rates that I've estimated for from the Stats South Africa firm surveys, which are much better at capturing births and deaths, then it doesn't make a huge difference, maybe 1 or 2 percentage points to the worker flow numbers. So this is something you can just see. I'm not going to talk a lot about it now because I'm running out of time already, but there is some. I'm just using basically the beginning of each tax year and looking at here these 4 periods. What's the difference in your employer identifier between the last tax year and the beginning of this tax year and the beginning of the last tax year? But you can see that there is this strange drop-off in the last 2 weeks of every tax year, and then also in the beginning of the new year, it takes a little while for that number to drop up, to increase. I've redone some of the work using the high points over here, which is sort of the middle of December in each year, and it doesn't really change anything. I think that, again, about a 1 or 2 percentage point increase in flows. So what does the panel look like? On the workers' side, in the 4 years, basically most of the people, or 44% of the people are there in every wave, and then you've got a bunch of other patterns. I'm sorry, you can't really see at the bottom, but there's about 12 million workers and about 300,000 firms in total. And the firms, about 54% of them are there in every period. And then you can see, well, what do the other patterns look like? What does the firm size distribution look like? The median firm is size 6. The mean is just under 40. And the median worker, if you rank the workers, this is a Shea and Kleinau way of doing things. If you put the median worker, what size firm do they work in? Well, this is huge. So this South African firms look dramatically different to even the Mexican firms in that Shea and Kleinau paper. So if you're interested, I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. So main results, this column over here, if you can, the number, the percentage of worker flows as a proportion of average employment in the last 2 years, pretty high. Mexico 71%, Brazil 84%, Germany 32%. So South Africa's not Mexico or Brazil, but it's also not Germany, I guess I'm saying. And much higher in smaller firms and much lower in very large firms. And then this is basically a measure of the median earnings in the firm, and you can see that firms that pay less have much higher flows the firms that pay more, and those are the numbers associated with the 20th, 40th, 60th, and 80th percentiles. That's rands per month. So, okay, this is a cool and interesting graph. There's been in this story, the US versus France has been the main comparison. French rigid labor market, and what About et al. And then a few other people have shown along the way is that actually French firms, or they purported to show this, French firms, when they are shrinking, they do that mainly by not hiring and don't fire people. And so what they saw is a relatively constant separation rate by firm growth rate. Whereas what you can see here is very similar to the US, that firms that are growing are doing lots of hiring and not much firing, but firms that are shrinking are doing lots of firing. Okay, we don't know this is firing, it's separation, so workers could be jumping ship if they see that things are going badly, but this interesting picture, there's a more recent paper from France which casts doubt on this. By this interpretation, South Africa is not France, it's not particularly rigid. There's a new paper 2 years ago for France saying, bizarrely, when they use the more, I think it's called an open-ended contract, the more protected contract, when they look at only those workers, they're showing that actually you get a similar pattern like this in France. So they're sort of saying, hey, hold on, everyone's been saying that there are these big differences between the US and France. Actually, we're not so sure about this, and bizarrely, the difference comes for the group of workers that you would expect the rigidity to occur for, those with more protected employment contracts. So if we look at worker earnings quintile, not in the firm, so this is now the values for each of those 20th, 40th, 60th, and 80th. You can see that there are extremely high flows for the people in the bottom 20%, and that those go down pretty dramatically for those in the top 20% of the earnings distribution. You might have a situation where you get both relatively high worker flows and also some people staying a long time in the same job. And what this shows you, comparison with Burgess using the Maryland unemployment insurance data, what proportion of people in surviving firms are still there 1 year later, 2 years later, and 3 years later. So 56% of people are still in the same firm 3 years later in the tax data, and you can see for yourselves and compare to the Maryland data, since I'm running out of time. Okay, industry, quite substantial differences. I want to draw your attention to the fact that I'm including the public sector, which has got very low worker flows, and the flow rates increase by about 6 percentage points if you include if you exclude the public sector. There are some interesting differences here, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip through this. I've also estimated the job flows, job destruction and creation, and I've tried to estimate churning, so the difference between worker flows and job flows, and that is a little bit less in South Africa than in the US, but still surprisingly large amounts of flows are churning flows. I was a bit surprised by that. Huge heterogeneity within industry, so industry effects explain almost nothing of these effects. So let me show you over here. So employer, industry, and time effects. Employer effects make the R squared really big, and industry effects basically do nothing. So this is the same old story that Haltewanga and co-authors have been going on about. If you look at average stuff in an industry, that isn't going to tell you anything. You really need to have a look at what's going on at the firm level. There's a lot of heterogeneity here. I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip through this, but just to say that there is a huge persistence in churning flows in employers. So you can see that basically firms that did have high churning flows still have relatively high churning flows a few years later. And if you look at job flows, there's basically straight regression to the mean. So that's kind of interesting, that churning is some sort of persistent outcome in some firms and not in others. And perhaps this is the result of different equilibrium labor policies or hiring policies or human resource policies within firms. Some firms do high wage and low churning, as I'll show now, and some firms do low wages and have relatively high churning. So that's what this OLS regression here says. So to conclude, I've run out of time. Worker flows are pretty substantial, more than I was expecting. Churning is really quite important, like it is in the US, perhaps a little bit less. There's a bunch of more work to be done on this data. It's nice to be able to advertise it, and I'm happy to answer questions about use of the data if you want to, although I'm not SARS, so I can't answer all your questions. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andrew, for the nice presentation. I'm not very familiar with this concept of the labor market, working flows and churning, but I learned a lot when I read the paper. So first, my impressions. So I think it is very nice to. So it is the first academic paper to explore the administrative data set from the South African Revenue Services. So I think it is very nice to do it, to explore this data set. Your main finding is that so you find high worker flows and churning in South African labor market, which suggests so a lower rigidities in the labor market. So it was a big challenge to use this data set, and I also appreciate that you raise some limitations and other concerns about the data. So it is pretty fair, and also so it is an interesting topic with direct policy implications, particularly in labor laws. But sure, you need to have more evidence to drive policies. So my general comments. So I think in the introduction of the paper, you focus more on the data, but you don't. I think you can have a more background and context about the South African labor market, and also to motivate maybe more the research question. And also, so in the paper, you say that you don't. The fact to not take into account the informal sector is not a big concern, but you have 6 million out of 15 million of workers who are in the informal sectors, so it is not negligible, I say. And some clarifications. So I just ask myself, why did you drop the individuals who are employed in more than one firm in the same year? So because so you may have some workers with multiple occupations. So why did you drop them? And also, how do you consider the independent workers? Do you drop them in your study, or you consider them? And if you consider them, maybe they are the causes of these high worker flows. I don't know. So your main conclusion is that in the South African labor market, you have low rigidities, But I think that some findings in the paper, they show rather that you have a segmented labor market. So there are 3 findings that show. I think that the evidence you show is support more the argument of the segmented labor market. So the first evidence is that so you find high workflows in firms with likely lower life expectancy and vulnerable jobs. And also you find low workflows in big firms. The second finding is that you find high workflows with smaller firms, so firms which employ less workers. And also you find high workflows for firms which pay less. So it seems to me that you have so a big sector, so the public administration and big companies, so where you have low workflows, and also some a low sector where you have vulnerable jobs, and where you have high workflows and high churning. So maybe you can think about that. And here just some suggestions. So in the paper, it's your reference paper. They study also the impact of the high workflows, the impacts of high workflows and job flows on the future employment. Maybe also you can do that. So not just measuring the flows, but also to study how the flows can impact the future labor market. So it is important for me also to distinguish in the hirings the newcomers in the labor market and the hirings from the individuals who lose their job. For me, it is 2 different things. So the newcomers is an indicator of the labor supply, the newcomers, and the individuals who lose their job measure the ability of the workers to find new jobs when they are fired. So maybe you can distinguish between those 2. And the third point, I see. You talk on this point on your presentations. Maybe I just missed it in the paper. Okay, I'm done.
Great, thanks. I'll respond to those.
Can take questions.
Sorry?
You want to answer? Yes. Okay.
So thanks. Those are helpful. So the difference between the number that you talked about and the number that I talked about in the paper is because I forgot about the fact that I'd excluded about, and I didn't say this in the presentation, 5% of the total employments in the tax data I didn't work with. And the reason for that is because in the very beginning, when I was setting up the data, that was extremely time costly, and it was easier to use people that all report a very specific job code, which is 3601. It's basically income from employment. And SARS told me they estimate that there's about 5% more of employed people coming from other tax codes. So you said almost 60%, which is what I said in the paper. The employment in this data represents 60%. It was 62% in the paper, and I've now managed to push that up. When I talk about the SARS data in total, represents about 70% of total employment, and that number's good, but I used 5% less than that in my actual study, because I just excluded those people with all the other random codes, which took a long time to extract from a very big database. What about independent workers? You mean people who are self-employed? like working
Yes.
by themselves? Okay, so they're in there if they are registered. And you could see that because the 10th percentile, I think, is still 1. So there's only one person there registered in the firm. So I think those are the independent workers, and there's actually quite a lot of them in the data. I suppose that's not actually that much. If we've got 250,000 firms and the 10th percentile is 1, that's only 25,000. But okay, I'll give that some thought. Thinking about this as a segmented labor market, yes. So that's kind of funny that I haven't thought about that, because I have been doing work on segmented labor markets or thinking about that a while ago. But I'll definitely give that some more thought. Total hiring, can we distinguish anything from those who come from the firm or those who come from unemployment? Yes, probably we could, and that is something which I could think about doing. Yeah, I think those are my responses.
You can take questions.
I don't know how rich your data is, but you said you have ID numbers, so I'm guessing you could use date of birth. So I know you're doing it from a firm level, but I mean, we know that the level of churning is much higher for young people relative to old people, and it could also be a nice way perhaps to distinguish between people that are being fired and people that are retiring in your data. So I know that's not the topic of interest, but do you have richer information on people that accept age as well? Do you have gender and things like that? Or?
I'll collect some questions and then I'll answer. And Francis wants to ask me what a firm is.
No, I'm not going to ask you that. So, I mean, obviously, it's not only extraordinarily interesting, it's extraordinarily surprising. I mean, that's basically your punchline. That we see almost as much churning in this labour market when unemployment rates are 25% plus.
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about? So, and it's not this paper, but it's, as it were, the follow-up thought. I mean, what's the periodicity of unemployment? I mean, my impression from reading about the South African labour market is that it was rather high. You weren't seeing a lot of people sitting around waiting for a job for a relatively short time. You were seeing a large number of people waiting a very long time. So what that will imply in your data is that the churning that you're observing is people within the labour market moving within the labour market. So what that's telling you is that entering the labour market is extraordinarily difficult, and that there's a problem at the lower end of the distribution, probably of education, ability, and being black, that makes it extremely hard to get into the labour market. Once you're in, your problems largely evaporate. Now, that's an interpretation, but it's, you know, in terms of linking this to what people think about the South African labour market, we need to know how the very high churning rates that you see can link with this high unemployment rate. And the other dimension, which again is not this paper, but it's something you can obviously look at, which is the rate of growth of employment in total, because presumably that is far below the rate of growth of the labour force. And then that's, as it were, shifting you to thinking about what's the constraints on aggregate employment growth. You're looking at the churning, but that churning must be in the context of relatively small net employment growth in these firms, if it's going to link to an unemployment story of high periodicity.
Other questions?
Okay, I'll answer those. Yes, so sadly, the ID numbers are anonymized, so we can't see those. But SARS did at some point say that they were going to make that data available for us, extract the age, and I think you can extract gender also from the ID number. But I never got that. So, yeah, maybe you can go and do that. Yes, I agree, Francis. I hadn't thought about the fact that, you know, how that linked with the story of lots of people spending a huge amount of time in unemployment, and this links to the comment from the discussant that yes, one of the things I can definitely check is this a hire that's coming from someone who's never before, say in the 2014 year, now we've got 3 years of data before, you know, what number of the hires or what proportion of the hires are coming from people who don't appear in the data in any of the 3 years before? I mean, that would be a nice one. So they don't, you know, that might get to your, I guess you're saying you know the answer to that question, but it'd be nice to check it. Yeah, sure.
One question.
But, I mean, what do you know about the individual? Can you track individuals over time? Do you know how long they spend out of the labour market?
We just know in these 4 years how often they appear as employed in a firm. So yes.
So yes is the answer. So the logic is that a possible interpretation of what you're looking at is a high churning labour market of a fixed number of people, excluding people at the bottom. In other words, your South Africa looks like everybody else. Well, no, South Africa is radically different from everybody else. It's found a device for excluding people at the bottom.
The call for proposals that I responded to asked for work on firm level stuff. So I guess that's, thinking about it, that's sort of how I steered myself in this direction rather than in the kind of like individual, more labor market perspective. That's, yeah, thanks, that's very helpful. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Andrew. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being here for the last presentation. So please tell me for the timing if it remains. So the paper I will present is about decent work or migration. So I want to compare the impact of a decent local job and migration in reducing poverty and promoting education. It is an evidence from Senegal. It is also a joint work with Théophile Azomo. So as you know, labor market issues are one of the main challenges of African countries, and particularly Senegal. So the unemployment rate in Senegal is estimated at 10.3%, well above the average in sub-Saharan Africa. And also the quality of jobs is one big issue in Senegal. In this situation, migration is a valuable alternative, and even when migration policies are more restrictive, many people opt for migrating in illegal ways. The paper by May 2014 indicates that in 2006, half of the 30,000 illegal migrants landed in the Canary Islands were Senegalese, and argues that illegal migrants overstayed their returns to migration. And also the studies of the impact of migration is particularly relevant in the case of Senegal. The share of remittances of GDP in Senegal is about 11%, placing Senegal at the 5th position in sub-Saharan Africa, so after Gambia, Lesotho, Liberia, and Comoros. So these aspects lead us to wonder about the real values of the returns to migration, and our objective is to to analyze which alternative between migration and access to a decent local job has greater impact on poverty reduction and human capital investments in Senegal. So we are not aware of previous studies that compare explicitly the impact of migration and decent work. So I will not comment the literature to save time. So we are interested in the investment in education, particularly because a decent job can contribute to reduce poverty through the stability of labor income, the security, and the protection of employment. So our assumption is that when you get a decent job, even if the job is not very highly paid, it can allow the worker to better manage his income and to invest in the household members' well-being and human capital. And this is the argument by Banerjee and Duflo. In their book, Poor Economics, they said, when a member of the family gets a stable job, the schools are more likely to accept his children. The hospitals provide high quality and more expensive care for sick family members, and the other relatives may be able to invest more adequately to develop their business. There is also world literature about the impact of migration on education and the impact of employment on education. To summarize my findings, so we find that decent work is a good substitute of migration in reducing poverty, and also a decent work has an increasing impact on investment in children's educations, but we find little support of a positive impact of migration on education. We use data from a representative survey conducted in 2011 in Senegal, and we work with a sample of 5,600 households distributed in all regions of Senegal. So we compute an index of decent work based on the description of the ILO, and so we use 3 criteria to define a decent work. And so the worker should meet these 3 criteria to be qualified as a decent worker. The first criteria is that the worker should not be underemployed, so working less than 40 hours per week, and this is important, whereas he may wish to work more. The second criteria, the worker should be affiliated to a social security system, namely a pension fund or a health care mutual. And the third criteria, the worker should have a stable and secure employment, and we capture this by a permanent contract. In empirical analysis, so we do some robustness checks. So we drop these criteria one by one, but the results don't change. So for descriptive statistic, I think I will. So what is important here is that we have 5.7% of the households with at least one decent worker and 5.7% of households with at least one migrant. And we have very few households with more than one decent workers and very few households with more than one migrant. So we just, to capture decent work and migration, we just use a demi-variable, taking one if the household has at least one migrant, or if the household has at least one decent worker. And we have also very few households with both a migrant and a decent worker. So we see here that the annual consumption and educational expenditure is higher for the households with a decent worker. So we use this empirical strategy. So we estimate this equation. Yi is the logarithm of the annual consumption of the households per adult equivalent. And in the second part, it is the spending on education per child aged between 6 and 16. And DI is the a demi-variable, taking 1 if the household has at least 1 decent worker and 0 otherwise. And MI, a demi-variable if the households have at least 1 migrant and 0 otherwise. And also we include a set of control variables. So of course, we have a problem of endogeneity. And endogeneity may be due to self-selection into migration, and self-selection into access to a decent work, and also reverse causality. And so we use 2 identification strategies. So the first one is a matching method, and the second one, an instrumental variable strategy. So for the matching method, so we consider the general framework of Rosenbaum and Rubin. And so here, YIT is a vector of the potential outcomes. YI0 is the potential outcome for the controlled households, so the households with no migrant and no decent worker. And YID, the potential outcome for the households with at least 1 decent worker. And YIM, the potential outcome for the households with at least 1 migrant. And so we rely on these 2 assumptions, the 2 standard assumptions in matching, the common support and the conditional independence. Okay, so we have 2 treatments. So we apply the marginal mean weighting stratification method. That is a matching method that combines weighting and stratification. So we use this method following these 3 steps. So in the first steps, we estimate the propensity score for each treatment using a bivariate probit model. So to take into account the decision of migration and the decision of having access to decent work that can be made simultaneously. The second step, we stratify using these propensity scores into quintile categories. And so we compute the marginal mean weight as follows. So NST is the number of households in the stratum ST. This is the proportion of the households which receive the treatment T. And here we have the number of households receiving the treatment T in the stratum ST. And then finally, we use a linear weighted least square regression using these weights. And also we apply the Bonfermi correction to correct the confidence intervals. So for the instrumental variable strategy, we use proxies of network in labor market and network in migration. So the first instrument is the proportion of other households. I exclude the households I. The proportion of other households in the county and in the ethnic group, which have at least 1 member employed in a decent job. And the second instrument is also the proportion of other households in the county and in the ethnic group, which have at least 1 migrant. So to ensure the homogeneity of my instruments, I need to control for counties fixed effects and ethnic group fixed effects. But this is too restrictive, so I just control by region fixed effects. Regions are larger than counties, and region, so I add also ethnic group fixed effects. And when I control by region fixed effects, I also include the average counties wealth. So this is the average treatment effect. So following the regression with all controls and all fixed effects, So we have a positive impact of a decent work, and also a positive and significant impact of migrations. And the two coefficients here are not statistically different. So we have the same impact of decent work and migration. So here we have the results for the instrumental variable strategy. So as I said, when I include the ethnic fixed effects in column 5, look at the column 5. When I include the Conti and ethnic fixed effects, so it drops the impact of migration. Thank you. And when so I just put the region fixed effects, and we have positive and significant impact of decent work and migration, and the coefficients are not statistically different. So I will not comment this. So here, just when I restrict migration to developed countries, so namely Europe, US, and Canada, the impact of migration is higher, but there's two coefficients. The coefficient of decent work and migration are not different. So it is always the same impact. So quickly, for the impact on investment in education, I also find with the matching method both positive impact and significant at the 1% level. So here, the average terminal effects for a decent work is 2 times higher than average terminal effect for migration, but always the difference between the two is not significant. So So for the instrumental variable strategy, I don't have an impact of migration, but I have positive impact of a decent work. And unless I restrict migration to rich countries, so I have a positive impact of migration, but the difference is not significant. So here I studied the interaction effect, but I think I don't have enough time. Okay. So to conclude, a decent job promotes the stability in the households and allows household members to have a forward-looking behavior. So I find similar impact of decent work and migration on the consumption of the households, but migration don't impact the education of children. Thank you.
Thanks for the interesting paper. I like the idea of comparing different things in the literature that people have looked at and trying to work out what the effect is on consumption or household welfare. You didn't talk much about the model, but that's in your paper, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit. I guess some of my questions were, in the model that you have, there doesn't seem to be much, or there isn't any heterogeneity across individual households or different households. So what is determining which households go for decent work and send somebody to go and queue for a job like you have in the model, and what determines whether some households go for sending a migrant away? So that was something that maybe I thought you could touch on or maybe try and incorporate somehow. Perhaps you could think about some sort of wealth constraint or minimum level of consumption that people need to meet before they can try for one of these strategies, because there also wasn't something to say to determine whether someone actually or a household takes this strategy or neither. That didn't appear in the model as far as I could see. why only one migrant per household? That seems to be true in the data. But presumably that one of the reasons why that might be is that you send one person, that person is successful, and then the whole household goes. And I guess that's also something I worry about in terms of estimating the effect of migration. That the very successful people who got a good job, who were able to send money back home, then sent enough money back home that the people could follow them to wherever they were. Yeah. And that maybe it might be less costly if you've got a very big household, which is what I learned about Senegalese households from another presentation also yesterday. What about sending a second member? Is that then less costly than sending the first one? Contacts, you've got somebody there, you know how the story works. It's much easier for you. And then thinking about decent work. Every time I read decent work, I thought, and your slide wasn't quite correct. You said 95% of households have any person in decent work, but that wasn't right. It was 5%, right? It's 5% have any. 95% don't have anyone in decent work. So this is people now at the very, very top of the income distribution. So when I heard decent work, what I was really hearing is, what's the effect of having someone in the top 5 or 10% of the income distribution? And that question to me is less interesting, I guess, than the decent work one. So maybe just some characteristics. Are these people in the very top of the income distribution? Are they all in the public sector, for example? Can self-employment be considered to be decent work? So I'm throwing back a question about independent workers to you after you gave one to me. You talked about adult equivalents, but you didn't mention how they're measured. I don't know if that's because there's a standard way of doing it in the literature. Angus Deaton came to South Africa and gave a lecture 20 years ago, and now all South Africans who do poverty and inequality measurement use his method that he sort of thumb-sucked on the day, but he's a Nobel laureate, so perhaps that's fine. So just mention how you're calculating your adult equivalents. And then in the tables, they all have per capita, at least the ones in the paper. Sorry, I didn't notice these ones. So I was a bit confused. You said you were using adult equivalent consumption, but then the tables all had per capita. What about internal migration? So in one of your sets of regressions, you had internal transfers, and I presume that meant transfers within the country, yes, rather than external. So that is another story that you didn't mention here, is how much internal migration there is. Is that much more important or less important? And perhaps you could think about incorporating that as another potential thing to look at the effect of, as well as the overseas migration. Why should the IV increase the migration effect so dramatically? I guess that's something which you didn't. I don't know why that might be. Is it a local average treatment effect or something like that? But I don't know. Maybe other people have thoughts for you on that one. I guess I just didn't know why it would increase by 4 or 5 times. Yeah, I think that's all my comments. Thanks.
I'll answer quickly to some of the questions by Andrew. Thank you very much for this discussion. So you raised very good points. So I will not have time to discuss all the points. Maybe for the theoretical model, I don't have. So I don't present it here because the time is not. Because of the constraints of time, yes, but I will think about the determinants, the heterogeneity in the households. Okay, so I think. So when you talk about the migrants, okay, the household send a migrant abroad. So. In my data, I don't consider the income of the migrant abroad because I don't have it. So what I have is the households which are in the country, and I'm comparing these households with the households with decent workers. But it is a good point, But yes, I have data constraints to measure. what the well-being of the migrant abroad. So I have the same proportion, nearly the same proportion of households with a decent work and households with migrant. So maybe a decent. So my criteria for decent work are very restrictive, maybe. So maybe I'm taking very rich households, but sometimes people consider remittances as very high, and so my idea. When I began the project, many people told me that sure, the impact of migration will be higher than the impact of decent work, because many studies they show that migration has very high impact on poverty. So it was not very obvious at the beginning to have similar impact, but I will think about it. So quickly, why the IV has increase the coefficients. I don't know really, but I know that I cannot compare the coefficients of the IV if the coefficients of the average treatment effect. So maybe the IV captures the local average treatment effects. So it considers the impact for. So my IV is the network. So the coefficients of the IV is, I think, the impact of migrations for the households which have a big network. So that is very high. Why the coefficients is increasing. So we don't have enough time. Maybe if you have some questions, I can answer quickly. No question. Okay. Thank you very much for attending.